Okay, imagine for a second contrasting our world today, full of individual choices, instant information, global connections with, say, the world of the ancient Greeks or Romans.
Seems pretty different, right? A huge gap.
Exactly. Well, people living back in the 14th century started doing something remarkably similar. They began looking back at that classical world and realizing just how much their own immediate past, what we now call the Middle Ages, uh, differed.
And that realization wasn't just like a casual thought. It really sparked a period of truly massive transformation in Europe
Yeah, fundamentally shifting things, moving from a world often centered around the church and, your inherited status.
to one that began to value individual achievement,
Yeah.
lively debate, and, well, a deep engagement with worldly pursuits, art, science, commerce.
How exactly did that happen, though? How did Europe navigate this huge shift over just a few centuries?
Well, that's what we're diving into today.
Welcome to this deep dive. We're exploring this fascinating era of cultural change in Europe, roughly stretching from the 14th through the 17th centuries, a period historians much later labeled the Renaissance.
And to guide us through this complex terrain, we've got some really rich source material. We're not just looking at textbook summaries, we're pulling from excerpts of historical texts.
Writings from people who actually lived through these changes.
Exactly. It gives us a direct window into their perspectives, their experiences. It's like getting dispatches and observations straight from the ground in the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries.
Right. So our mission with this deep dive is to unpack the key shifts that defined this time, how culture, learning, art, and maybe most importantly, how people saw themselves and the entire world around them transformed.
We're going to pull out the most important nuggets and, surprising facts from these sources.
We'll weave them together to give you a shortcut, really, to understanding this absolutely foundational era in European history. It's more than just dates and names. It's about a fundamental change in mindset.
Okay, let's set the stage then, shall we? To understand the transformation, we really need to see where things started.
Where were we in the 14th century?
Let's look at Europe, specifically the landscape of Italy after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The picture is one of, well, political fragmentation.
No single Italy yet.
Not at all. There wasn't a unified government holding the peninsula together. The Pope in Rome certainly held significant spiritual authority, and he exercised sovereignty over territory in central Italy.
But he didn't rule a unified Italian state, not in the way we might think of a modern nation.
Precisely. And meanwhile, if you looked at Western Europe more broadly, it was largely dominated by feudalism, that system built on land ownership, loyalty oaths, lords, vassals. Power was pretty decentralized.
And to east.
To the east, you had the lingering power of the Byzantine Empire and the growing influence of the world of Islam. Italy was kind of geographically situated right in the middle of these spheres.
The crossroads, in a way.
Definitely. And within that fragmented Italian landscape, something really distinct was starting to flourish: the rise of towns.
Not just villages, but proper centers.
Exactly. These weren't just small clusters of buildings. They became powerful political, economic, and cultural centers in their own right. Our sources point to places like Florence and Venice as prime examples.
Republics, city-states.
Right, republics, or at least city-states, where citizens played a really central role in governance. That's a stark contrast to areas elsewhere in Europe, where the power structure was much more rigidly dominated by hereditary nobility and the clergy.
That must have felt very different for someone living there. You weren't just tied to the land or a lord. Your status and potential influence could be tied to your life in the city.
Absolutely. And the power structure within these cities began to shift significantly. While in many other European areas, clergy and feudal lords undeniably held the reins.
In Italian city-states like Venice and Florence, merchants and bankers rose to immense prominence.
They weren't just accumulating wealth, though they certainly did that. They were actively participating in government, challenging that traditional dominance of inherited noble titles or church hierarchy.
Now, it wasn't full democracy, right?
No, not by any stretch. Our sources note the complexity. Even though some Italian cities fell under the rule of despots, powerful individuals or families who took control, others, like Venice and Genoa, maintained forms of republican government.
And there was this strong sense of local pride.
Oh, definitely. A strong sense of townsfolk, pride, and identity tied to the city itself. Though, interestingly, this pride in citizen participation also meant they often relied on citizen militias for defense.
Ooh, which could be a weakness.
It could. It sometimes made their military forces relatively weaker compared to the standing armies of larger territorial states evolving elsewhere. It's a kind of tension, civic pride versus military strength.
And what fueled all this urban dynamism, the rise of the merchant class?
Trade. Trade was a massive, indispensable catalyst. These Italian cities were perfectly positioned geographically to connect Europe to the wider world.
Trading with Byzantium, the Islamic world?
Exactly. They traded extensively with the Byzantine Empire, acting as a gateway to the East, and with Islamic countries around the Mediterranean. And significantly, the Mongol conquests from the 12th century onwards.
Which were disruptive, surely.
Disruptive in many ways, yes. But they also had the effect of reopening and securing the Silk Route, facilitating trade networks all the way to China and the East.
So more than just spices and silk.
Oh, much more. That was certainly part of it, bringing immense wealth into these cities, creating those prominent merchant and banking families. But that wealth wasn't just hoarded.
It fueled culture, patronage.
Precisely. It became patronage. It fueled cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Ideas, technologies, artistic styles, they flowed along these trade routes through ports like Venice, right into the heart of Italy.
So this vibrant economic life fostered the development of a distinct urban culture.
Yes, our sources mention that towns were growing across Europe from the 14th century, but the Italian cities were often at the forefront. Townsfolk began to cultivate a different identity.
Seeing themselves as more civilized.
Kind of, yeah. More sophisticated, maybe, than people in rural areas. These urban centers, particularly Florence, Venice, and Rome, became magnets for art and learning, heavily patronized by those wealthy merchant and banking families.
The ones who now had the means, the leisure, and maybe the desire to spend their fortunes on more than just fortifications or churches?
Exactly, they invested in culture.
Okay, this brings us to a crucial point about how we even talk about this period. The term Renaissance, you mentioned it came later.
Right. It wasn't something people in the 14th or 15th century called themselves or their era.
It's important to understand that Renaissance is a label coined much later, specifically by historians in the 19th century, to describe these cultural changes spanning roughly the 14th to 17th centuries.
And the literal meaning is rebirth. The idea behind the term was this perceived revival of Greek and Roman culture and traditions.
People in the period did look back to antiquity for inspiration.
Oh, absolutely, consciously so. But the concept of the whole era being a singular rebirth and the name Renaissance itself came later, shaped by historical interpretation.
And this is where Jacob Burckhardt comes in, the Swiss scholar.
Exactly. He's a key figure in shaping that 19th century understanding. His hugely influential book, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, published in 1860, really cemented this idea of the Renaissance as a distinct period.
And what made his work so significant, he focused on culture.
Yes, that was the big difference. Contrasting him with contemporaries like Leopold von Ranke, who focused more on politics and states, Burckhardt emphasized culture as the primary concern for the historian.
He wanted to understand the spirit of the age.
Exactly. The mindset. The cultural changes, not just the political power plays. He saw culture as the engine of historical change in this period.
And central to his interpretation was this idea of the individual emerging.
Yes, his characterization of the individual who emerged during the 14th century. He saw this person as capable of making their own decisions, developing their innate skills and potential.
Modern individual.
He famously described it as the emergence of the modern individual, sharply contrasting this with his view of the medieval person, whose thinking, he argued, was largely constrained and controlled by the church and by rigid social structures.
That contrast is a really crucial, though maybe debated, concept for this deep dive.
It is. The idea that this period marked a shift towards recognizing the individual as having agency, the capacity for self-definition and achievement, independent to some extent from inherited status or purely religious dictates.
The idea of the self being shaped by your own actions and studies, not just your birthright.
Precisely.
Okay, let's dive a bit deeper into how these changing ideas showed up in something as fundamental as government. We can look at Venice again, through Cardinal Contarini's eyes.
Yes, Gasparo Contarini, writing about Venice's government in 1534. It gives us a fantastic window into how people at the time were trying to articulate these new social realities.
So what did he say made Venetian government work?
Well, he talks about admitting people who possess wisdom, understanding, and maybe are ordained by ancestors. So, acknowledging tradition and lineage.
But there's more to it.
Yes. Then he also explicitly mentions people admitted based on wealth or ability, provided they've lived in the city for a significant period, like 25 years.
So you really see that tension playing out. Wisdom and virtue should govern, he seems to say.
Right, not just lineage or inherited wealth. But then, almost in the same breath, he defines the basis for public rule as deriving from ability and abundance of riches.
Ability and
It's
money.
a fascinating compromise, isn't it? He's trying to praise the traditional Venetian system, but the language reveals the new reality. It wasn't enough just to be wise or virtuous.
You needed practical ability and economic power to join the governing elite.
And that 25-year residency requirement also speaks volumes, doesn't it? It values being a long-standing, committed member of the urban community, not just someone who inherited land nearby.
So for you, the listener, this text from Contarini shows a tangible example of power structure starting to shift. It's a move away from purely hereditary or divinely ordained power.
Toward systems where practical skills, accumulated wealth, and demonstrated commitment to the city became legitimate, even necessary, qualifications for participating in governance.
Not modern democracy, but definitely a different set of criteria than feudal obligation.
Definitely.
Now, where were these changing ideas about knowledge? The past, the individual being formally nurtured and spread. Universities must have played a role.
Universities were key institutions, absolutely, but their focus began to broaden and transform. The earliest universities in Europe, places like Padua and Bologna in Italy, initially focused heavily on teaching law.
Which makes sense in those commercial hubs.
Exactly. There was a high demand for lawyers and notaries to draft contracts, handle property disputes, navigate complex trade regulations.
But a shift occurred.
A profound shift, yes. Over time, the focus expanded dramatically beyond just law or theology. There was a deliberate turn towards the study of ancient Roman culture and the languages of the ancient Greeks.
And this is where humanism really starts.
This is really where humanism begins to take shape as a distinctive intellectual movement that redefined the purpose of learning.
So what was humanism exactly?
Well, it wasn't a single rigid doctrine. It was primarily an educational program and intellectual movement that gained momentum throughout the 14th and 15th centuries.
Focusing on specific subjects.
Yes, the subjects taught by those we now call humanists were specific: grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. These were known collectively as the Studia Humanitatis, the studies of humanity.
And the name humanism itself.
It comes directly from the Latin word humanitas, which was used by classical Roman writers like Cicero. For them, humanitas meant culture, cultivation of the mind and character, refinement through learning.
So the humanists were explicitly looking back to classical ideals.
Very much so. And what's really striking, and a significant departure from the earlier medieval focus on theology and logic, often tied to religious texts.
Is that these humanist subjects, grammar, rhetoric, history, moral philosophy, weren't primarily centered on religion.
Right. They were developed by individuals through the study of classical texts and through active discussion and debate. It was a move towards intellectual inquiry that wasn't necessarily mediated or controlled by the church hierarchy.
And this emphasis on active intellectual engagement, on discussion and debate, was central to their idea of human dignity.
Absolutely central. We had the incredible voice of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a brilliant humanist from Florence, writing in his famous work on the dignity of man.
He didn't just state the importance of debate, did he?
No, he framed it as a vital exercise. Pico stressed that the pursuit of knowledge and vigorous debate were central to realizing human dignity. He had this wonderful physical analogy.
The mental workout analogy.
Exactly. He said the effort of debate strengthens the mind, making it more vigorous and alert, just as strenuous physical exercise strengthens the body.
I absolutely love that image. It speaks to a new energy and a profound value placed on intellectual activity itself, not just as a means to an end.
But as something intrinsically valuable for human development. And Florence, in particular, became a central intellectual and artistic hub by the 15th century.
Famed for figures like Dante and Giotto even before the full humanist flowering.
Right, but also producing figures who embodied the humanist ideal. Our sources describe the ideal person of this period as often being a remarkable blend, a scholar deep in classical texts, a skilled diplomat navigating city-state politics, maybe even a theologian, and an artist or patron of the arts.
It perfectly reflects that desire to develop multiple skills, to be competent and engaged across diverse fields, moving away from more specialized roles.
Exactly.
Now, tied directly to this humanist movement was a new way of looking at the past itself, wasn't there?
Yes, a very powerful narrative they developed. They felt they weren't just learning from antiquity, they were actively restoring a true civilization. The classical world that they felt had been lost after the collapse of the Roman Empire.
So to define their rebirth, they had to define what came before.
Precisely. They viewed the entire millennium after the fall of Rome, roughly from the 5th to the 14th centuries, as a period of decline, a dark age or the Middle Ages.
And they felt this darkness ended with them in the 14th century.
Pretty much, yeah. They somewhat unreservedly assumed this darkness began with Rome's decline, and that a new, brighter era began squarely with their own activities. They argued explicitly that during this Middle Ages, the Church had exerted too much intellectual control.
Stifling independent thought, preventing understanding of the Greeks and Romans.
That was their argument. They felt this dominance had prevented a true understanding and appreciation of classical knowledge, which they saw as paramount. So they essentially created a new, three-part periodization of history.
Classical world, Middle Ages, modern age.
Exactly. Glorious antiquity, followed by the 5th to 14th centuries as the Middle Ages, with the earlier centuries sometimes specifically labeled the Dark Ages, a term they invented, and then the period starting from the 15th century onwards, they proudly termed the modern age.
The era they felt they were ushering in. It's a neat, dramatic division.
Very neat. But as our source material implicitly reminds us, and as recent historical research confirms, this division isn't quite as sharp or accurate as the humanists like to think.
There was more cultural vibrancy in the Middle Ages than they gave it credit for.
A great deal more, yes. Intellectual activity, connection to classical and other knowledge, they had a vested interest, perhaps, in highlighting the darkness they were emerging from.
And speaking of connections, the idea of the Renaissance as solely a rebirth of Greek and Roman culture overlooks some really crucial bridges, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We need to talk about the unseen but vital contributions of Arab scholars.
This is such a critical piece of the puzzle that often gets less airtime.
Hugely critical. When much of the knowledge of Greek and Roman writers, philosophy, science, medicine became less accessible or even lost in parts of Europe after Rome fell.
It was often Arab scholars who preserved, studied, commented upon, and translated these works into Arabic.
Figures like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, a Persian polymath.
And Ibn Rushd of Veros.
Exactly, from Islamic Spain. They weren't just translators, they were brilliant philosophers and physicians who deeply engaged with figures like Aristotle and Galen, grappling with complex ideas, often trying to reconcile Greek philosophy with their own Islamic beliefs.
And it wasn't just philosophy.
Not at all. Arab scholars were absolutely crucial in transmitting knowledge in natural sciences, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry. Our sources use the compelling example of Ptolemy's Almagest.
The foundational astronomy text.
Right, written in Greek in the 2nd century AD. This complex work was first translated into Arabic, meticulously studied, and then much later translated from Arabic into Latin, making it accessible to European scholars again.
That shows a clear pathway of knowledge flow that wasn't just direct from Rome to Italy.
Definitely not. Knowledge and intellectual energy were preserved and advanced in the Arab world while parts of Europe were undergoing different transformations. These channels, involving scholars across North Africa, the Middle East, Islamic Spain,
They helped reintroduce classical texts and humanist subjects into European universities.
sometimes centuries after they were first translated into Arabic. It really complicates that simple rebirth narrative.
Now, let's shift to perhaps the most tangible legacy of this era, the incredible flowering of art and architecture.
Yes, a whole new visual language was developing, driven by that same spirit of inquiry and study.
We see a dramatic move towards much greater realism.
Huge realism, yes. In painting and sculpture, artists studying anatomy to render the human body accurately, mastering the use of perspective to create depth on a flat surface.
Capturing light and shadow, using richer colors.
Exactly. It looked profoundly different from the often symbolic or stylized art that came before it. And the artists themselves began to embody that ideal of the multi-skilled individual.
Leonardo da Vinci being the prime example.
Of course, the ultimate Renaissance polymath. His interests weren't confined to his easel. They spanned anatomy. He dissected bodies to understand them, mathematics, engineering, botany, geology.
Right, he's not just the genius behind the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. Our sources remind us he spent years observing birds, fascinated by flight, designing flying machines.
And he famously described himself in his notebooks as Leonardo da Vinci, disciple of experiment.
That phrase perfectly captures this new spirit curiosity, empirical observation, the active individual pursuit of knowledge, not just through books, but through the world itself.
And that intersection of art and science was incredibly fruitful. Knowledge of geometry, for instance, was directly applied by painters and sculptors to achieve that greater realism and perspective.
Creating convincing illusions of space.
Right. And the adoption of the oil medium for painting allowed for much richer colors and subtle blending compared to earlier tempera paints.
And our sources even note potential influences from Chinese and Persian art.
Yes, in the vibrant colors and elaborate costumes depicted in some paintings, again highlighting those sometimes unacknowledged global connections flowing along trade roads.
Architecture also saw a dramatic rebirth, especially in Rome.
Yes, especially as the popes became politically strong again after periods of weakness and actively encouraged building programs. They didn't just admire the ruins of imperial Roman buildings, they meticulously studied them.
Measuring proportions, analyzing construction techniques.
Exactly. These classical structures became the direct inspiration for a new architectural style based on classical principles. Columns, arches, domes, symmetry, proportion.
A deliberate revival of the imperial Roman style.
Very deliberate and conscious. Figures like Filippo Brunelleschi, whose ingenious design for the massive dome of Florence's Duomo was a technical marvel drawing on ancient Roman techniques.
And Michelangelo with St. Peter's Dome and his sculptures.
Monumental work. Buildings were seen as integrated works of art, canvases for sculpture, painting, relief work, and this era produced theorists who articulated these new ideas.
Like Leon Battista Alberti.
Yes, Alberti, humanist, architect, artist. He wrote hugely influential treatises like on painting, on sculpture, on architecture. He was one of the first to articulate this modern concept of the artist as an intellectual.
An architect who could conceive the whole work, plan it, oversee it, not just a craftsman.
Precisely. He stressed that beauty in architecture wasn't arbitrary. It was based on mathematical harmony related to the proportions of the human form and adapted to human uses again, putting humanitas at the center.
And what's truly revolutionary here, reflecting that rising status of the individual,
is that artists began to be known individually by name and celebrated for their unique genius.
Before, they were often more anonymous, part of guilds or workshops.
Largely, yes. Individual contributions were less emphasized. Now, names like Leonardo, Michelangelo, Brunelleschi, Alberti were becoming famous across Europe. Their styles recognizable. It reflects a growing recognition of individual talent and creative innovation.
Speaking of individual recognition, and maybe more importantly, the rapid spread of ideas, nothing revolutionized that quite like printing.
Oh, absolutely. Johannes Gutenberg's invention of printing with movable type in Mainz, Germany around 1455 was, quite simply, a game changer on a global scale. A monumental one.
Think about what came before. Books copied by hand.
Painstakingly copied by hand, often by scribes in monasteries or workshops. Incredibly slow, expensive, and prone to errors. A single copy could take months, even years.
Which severely limited availability and access.
Hugely. Suddenly, with printing, you could produce hundreds, eventually thousands, of identical copies of a text relatively quickly and cheaply.
Ideas could spread far more rapidly and widely than ever before.
And printed books weren't just for kings, monasteries, or wealthy universities anymore. They became accessible to a much broader range of people and institutions.
But it's essential to acknowledge, as our sources remind us, that Europeans weren't inventing everything in isolation here.
Absolutely crucial point. While Gutenberg's movable type press was a European innovation, the underlying technologies like papermaking and block printing had originated much earlier in China.
And were transmitted across Asia.
Yes. Europeans were indebted to other cultures, facilitated by those trade and contact networks we discussed, for printing technology itself, as well as other crucial innovations of the time like firearms, the magnetic compass, the abacus. Knowledge transfer was multidirectional.
And printing played a key role in rapidly circulating that humanist culture across Europe.
A vital role. Suddenly, classical texts that humanists had unearthed and edited could be printed and distributed widely, but perhaps even more impactful in the long run.
Was the printing of Bible translations into local languages?
Exactly. Vernacular Bibles. This would have profound consequences. Which brings us to another deeply fascinating aspect of the period, how the very concept of what it means to be human began to evolve and diversify.
Humanists didn't necessarily see people as less religious.
No. But perhaps less exclusively defined and controlled by religious doctrine. They were comfortable acknowledging human attraction to the material world, to worldly power, to personal glory, alongside spiritual concerns.
So the definition of a good life started to expand beyond just piety.
Yes, beyond just piety or fulfilling a role in the feudal or church hierarchy. We see figures like Francesco Barbaro, a Venetian humanist who actually wrote a defense of acquiring wealth.
Arguing it was necessary for the family and the city.
Right. And Lorenzo Valla, another humanist who valued a life of perfection, but also wrote a text that seemed to criticize traditional Christian ascetic views on pleasure.
Arguing that things like speaking politely, dressing correctly, social grace were important parts of a cultivated life.
Exactly. It suggests a broader, more worldly definition of virtue emerging. The implication, drawing from classical examples in urban life, was that individuals had the capacity and maybe the responsibility to actively shape their own lives.
To cultivate their skills and character, driven not just by religious dictates, but also by desire for worldly success, power, money.
Which is where the picture gets complex, maybe a little darker, and certainly more realistic.
Enter Machiavelli.
Yes, Niccolo Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat and writer. His work, The Prince, written in 1513, offers a stark, pragmatic view of human nature, informed by his own political experiences.
A direct contrast to some of the more optimistic humanist ideals.
Very much so. He saw people through a lens of political necessity. In The Prince, he describes human nature as fundamentally variable, ungrateful dissemblers, fearful, and motivated primarily by self-interest and greed.
Wow. He famously states that humans are all bad and ever ready to display their vicious nature.
Partly because of the fact that human desires are insatiable. It's a profoundly different perspective.
A chillingly clear-eyed view of how people actually behave, especially in politics, contrasting with the noble ideals of Pico or Valla.
It's not necessarily a denial of humanist ideals, but perhaps a pragmatic assessment of human reality that needed to be acknowledged, especially by a ruler.
This era also saw the crystallization of a new concept of human beings having distinct private and public spheres.
Yes, that distinction becomes clearer. The individual as a private person, inner thoughts, family, community, religion, but also as a public role holder, a citizen, a participant in the state.
Which allowed for ideas about expressing individual personality even in public roles.
Exactly. And over centuries, it contributed to the development of concepts like equal political rights based on one's status as a citizen, not just a subject.
Now, while we're discussing changing ideas about human beings and the individual, it is absolutely critical, as our sources compel us to do, to look at the aspirations and realities of women during this time.
Yes, the picture here is complex. We have to acknowledge that education and citizenship largely excluded women from direct participation in public life and power structures in the way men were increasingly participating.
It's an essential counterbalance to the idea of the universally rising individual.
Definitely. Aristocratic families, for instance, educated their sons for public life, business, law, the church. Daughters, however, typically received education primarily aimed at preparing them for marriage.
Dowries were crucial, often arranged marriages.
Yes, dowries were hugely important, often negotiated to strengthen business alliances. Marriages were frequently arranged based on economic and social considerations, not individual choice.
But this wasn't the experience for all women.
No, not monolithic. Our sources mention that women in merchant and banker families, especially in those dynamic city-states, sometimes ran shops or managed businesses, particularly after their husbands died.
Giving some women practical economic experience and a degree of agency.
Right. And while few women achieved public renown for intellectual pursuits compared to men, some absolutely did. Our sources highlight figures like Cassandra Fedele.
The Venetian humanist.
Yes, she was determined to pursue humanist education in Greek and Latin, engaging with classical texts just like her male counterparts.
And we also have powerful examples like Isabella d'Este.
The Marquesa of Mantua. She wasn't just a consort, she effectively ruled her state, was known for her intellectual brilliance, built famous art collections, and corresponded with many of the most influential figures of the time.
So women's writings, though maybe less numerous, sometimes reveal a strong conviction about their own power and education.
Exactly. A conviction regarding their economic power, property rights, and the intrinsic value of education for women themselves. It clearly shows that even within limiting structures, women were carving out spaces for influence and development.
And the changing ideas about the ideal person led to discussions about educated women, even among male writers.
Yes, like Balthazar Castiglione in his influential work, The Courtier, describing the ideal courtier woman.
His description is fascinating, a balance of delicate tenderness and robust manliness.
Kind of contradictory, right?
Yeah.
She should have grace, humor, modesty, prudence, but also be knowledgeable in letters, music, painting. She should be able to hold her own in witty, intelligent conversation.
He saw accomplishments as important, but virtues too.
Yes, he emphasized that fundamental virtues, integrity, wisdom, were just as essential for women as for men. His ideal reflects a societal conversation beginning to grapple with the idea of women as intellectual companions and capable individuals, even if framed within elite expectations.
Now, these humanist ideas, this focus on classical learning, individual potential, critical inquiry, they didn't stay confined to Italy, did they?
No, they spread north to other European towns and courts. This happened through various channels, the increasing trade we discussed, military movements, diplomatic contacts.
And when humanist ideas spread north, scholars there applied the methods differently.
They began applying humanist methods, rigorous study of original texts, critical analysis, attention to language and history, not just to classical pagan texts, but crucially to Christian texts.
Studying the Bible in its original languages, writings of the Church Fathers.
Exactly, comparing them to contemporary church practices and doctrines. And this scholarly examination, combined with the availability of printed Bibles in vernacular languages.
Led to significant criticism of the Church.
Intense criticism, yes. Practices like selling indulgences, the Church's immense wealth, and perceived extortion, rigid rituals all came under scrutiny.
Figures like Erasmus and Thomas More.
Leading examples of these Christian humanists. They questioned long-held assumptions about church traditions and promoted a simpler, more personal faith focused on living a holy life, inspired by their reading of early Christian texts.
Often rooted in a belief in a God who created humans as free and rational agents.
Right, perhaps lessening the perceived need for priestly intermediaries. This focus on a more personal relationship with faith, on individual conscience, and understanding Scripture directly.
Is a profound shift. It laid significant groundwork for future religious changes.
Definitely. And a major persistent demand that emerged was for the Bible to be available and understood by everyone. Translating it into local vernacular languages was key.
William Tyndale and the English New Testament.
Exactly. In 1526, he defended his work fiercely, arguing Scripture must be accessible in the mother tongue so that even a boy that driveth the plow could understand it.
A direct challenge to the Church's control over interpretation through Latin.
Absolutely. And this religious and intellectual ferment wasn't happening in a vacuum. Our sources mention peasant revolts against high taxes from lords and the church, and against church interference.
Sometimes reformers' ideas seem to lend support.
Perhaps inspiration, yeah. Humanists also directly challenged the historical basis of the church's worldly authority.
Like questioning the donation of Constantine.
Precisely. Using textual analysis and history, they questioned documents like that, which the papacy used to justify secular power. Lorenzo Valla proved it was a forgery in the mid-15th century.
That kind of critical scholarship undermined papal claims.
It did. And all of this intellectual, social, and textual criticism contributed to the seismic upheaval known as the Protestant Reformation.
Kicked off by Martin Luther.
While there were earlier calls for reform, Luther, the German monk, is widely credited with launching his campaign against the Catholic Church in 1517 with his 95 Theses.
His core emphasis on faith alone and direct contact with God.
Yes. Sola fide and the priesthood of all believers, fundamentally challenging the structure of authority of the Catholic Church. Other reformers quickly followed, Zwingli, Calvin.
Gaining popularity, often supported by merchants and princes.
Yes, for various religious, political, and sometimes economic reasons. And the Catholic Church, of course, responded with its own reform movement, the Counter-Reformation.
The Council of Trent, the Jesuits.
Exactly. Focused on defending Catholic doctrine, missionary work, education. These religious debates were incredibly intense, often violent, and profoundly transformative.
Solidifying ideas of individual conscience, even within new religious boundaries.
Alongside these shifts, there was a profoundly new way of understanding the physical world emerging what would later be formalized as science.
Reading the book of nature?
In a way, yes. Approaching nature not just as divine allegory, but as a system governed by discernible laws, to be read through observation. Galilei is a classic example.
His evolving view of the Bible. Guide to heaven, not how the heavens go.
Exactly. He saw it as essential for spiritual truth, but not as a source for understanding the physical world. This marks a fundamental turning point.
Knowledge based more on observation, measurement, experiment.
Yes. Distinct from knowledge derived solely from religious belief or ancient authorities. It was about empirical evidence. This new approach was adopted by figures who became foundational for the scientific revolution.
In physics, chemistry, biology, astronomy?
They weren't just speculating, they were looking, measuring, testing, It fundamentally changed how people sought and validated knowledge about the universe.
Even the view of God shifted for some.
It did. Skeptics and non-believers emerged, certainly. But even among believers, some began to see God more as a divine architect who created nature and its laws, but didn't necessarily interfere day to day. A more distant God, perhaps.
And the sharing of this new knowledge became organized.
Yes, through formal scientific societies like the Royal Society in London 1662 and the Paris Academy 1670, dedicated to promoting natural knowledge, sharing findings, debating based on evidence, conducting experiments.
Creating a new international community of scholars based on this empirical approach.
Laying the groundwork for modern science. Now, we've covered a huge amount of ground. It's worth circling back to the label Renaissance. Was it truly a clean break?
The core debate. Burckhardt saw it as a dramatic rebirth, distinct from the Dark Middle Ages. And people at the time sometimes exaggerated the difference to emphasize their return to classical ideals.
But as recent research suggests, the reality is more nuanced. There's significant evidence for continuity. The Middle Ages, particularly the 12th and 13th centuries, also saw significant artistic creativity, intellectual dynamism.
Gothic cathedrals, scholasticism, universities, Dante.
Exactly. The Renaissance wasn't born out of a vacuum. It built upon, reacted against, and transformed earlier medieval developments. And similarly flourishing wasn't confined to Italy.
There was dynamism elsewhere, like France in the 14th century.
Right, so viewing the Renaissance in Italy as a singular, isolated miracle might be an oversimplification.
Which leads us to a final crucial point highlighted by our sources mentioning technology and trade routes.
Yes. The cultural changes weren't solely due to the revival of classical Greek and Roman civilization, as the term Renaissance implies.
While that classical revival was hugely important for humanism, art, architecture,
We absolutely cannot ignore the independent importance of technological innovations, like the printing press, new navigation techniques, gunpowder, many with origins or development outside classical antiquity.
and critically, developments like the Mongol conquests linked Asia, North Africa, and Europe on an unprecedented scale.
Facilitating the movement of people, goods, technologies, information across Eurasia far beyond what was possible earlier.
So knowledge wasn't just flowing from ancient Greece and Rome to be reborn in Italy.
No, it was also moving actively from the Arab world, building on their preservation and advancements, and from India, Iran, Central Asia, China. Our source acknowledges Europe was often slow to credit these debts, but the exchange was happening.
Enriching Europe profoundly. It challenges you, the listener, to see this period not just through a Eurocentric lens,
But as part of a larger, interconnected, global exchange of ideas, technologies, wealth, and cultural influences that profoundly shaped Europe and, eventually, the world.
wow, we've really taken quite the deep dive today. From those fragmented yet vibrant Italian city-states through humanism, the explosion in art and architecture, the printing revolution, changing ideas about humanity and women, the Reformation's religious shifts, and the beginnings of modern science.
It is a period absolutely packed with transformative change across almost every area of human life and thought. And the so what for you, the listener, is immense.
Because these shifts weren't just historical curiosities.
Not at all. They laid crucial groundwork for so much of the modern world. The emphasis on individual achievement, critical thinking, the rapid spread of information, scientific inquiry, even how we think about history itself.
Understanding this era isn't just about knowing the past. It's about making sense of the fundamental roots of the modern world, the forces and ideas that began to take shape here.
It's where many assumptions and structures of contemporary society find their origins. And it leaves us with a thought to ponder.
Yeah.
Considering how much the transmission of knowledge and the very possibility of these transformations relied on dynamic connections across diverse cultures, Arab, Chinese, Central Asian, European, does thinking about the Renaissance, still primarily as a rebirth of just one ancient tradition, Greece and Rome, truly capture the full story?
What does this period teach us about where innovation and profound cultural change really come from? Is it purely internal, or is it often sparked by the confluence of ideas and technologies from unexpected, far-flung places?